So, in the last lecture, we discussed the issue of defining a differential equation for a straight line in some manifold which has a metric. It could be a flat space like a sheet of paper expressed in polar coordinates, or it could be a genuinely curved manifold like the surface of a sphere. What we found, and I explained to you, that the standard equation we would have written, that there is no acceleration, is UA dA of UB equals 0, where UB is a tangent vector to a curve. So, you are thinking of a curve and there is a tangent vector which is UA, which is of course dxa by some parameter S. For definiteness, you can think of this as a curve in the space time, S as the proper time and this as the 4 velocity, or the generalization of the normal velocity to 4 dimension. Yesterday I used the notation V for that, but whether you call it V or U, it is the same thing. We started with this equation and I showed you that this is not a good equation. This is not a good equation because if I go from one frame to another, this thing does not transform like a tensorial object. So, we want to have a generalization of that, and we found that you can actually find a generalization if we can get the correct equation by some other method. And the correct equation you can find by saying that among all the curves connecting these 2 points, this straight line is the one with extremal length. We did that and we did get an equation, and that equation read something like this. I do not remember whether it was A or B, it does not matter, dUA by ds equals half dA of some GLM, let us say, multiplied by UL/UM. This was the equation we found. What I am going to do is to rewrite this equation in a particular way so that it can be directly compared with this equation. Okay. Our aim is to generalize this partial derivative into something which I have loosely called the covariant derivative, so that everything will be fine when you make transformation from one frame to the other. We know that this equation is completely generally covariant. It is valid in all frames because we started with the integral length which is valid in all frames. So, we want to rewrite this in this form. So, to do that, what I will do is to write this part as d by ds of this UA is GAB or even UAL, let us say, UL, because if you lower that L, you get this, this quantity A. Now, this when you differentiate out, first you get a GAL DUL by ds. This we will keep as it is. Then I am going to get a second term which is UL times d by ds of GAB. So, d by ds of GAB, let me call it UM dm of GAB. I hope you are with me, because UM is dxm by ds. So, dxm by ds and there is a d by dxm there, they just cancels out and this is like d by d tau of g. So, you have got up to this GAL, sorry. So I should, yeah, correct, thank you. Okay, so there is a GAL and all the indices are now contracted, A is the only free term. So, we have got up to this and we want to write it in a slightly more symmetric form. If you see here on the right hand side, you have LM and a UL/UM. Here on the left hand side, you have, there is a L and an M which is contracted with these, but we would like to have one with A as well. Okay. So, that you can easily adjust, because if you just flip the terms, You can also get one which is going on to the other. That is, you use the fact that this L and M and this M and L, this L and M are symmetric. So I can write this as half of, let me write it down and then explain, that is easier. There was a UL here. I am going to write it as half of this plus UL UM DL of GAM. What have I done? Here I had a UL UM and there was an M and L here. So if I change M and L here, I get this term. But that changing is just flipping L and M in this, and since it is symmetric, this is allowed. So now I can take this UL UM out, and you get this. So now I have one term with a derivative with respect to M, one term with a derivative with respect to L, and one term with derivative with respect to A. So this is the left hand side, and you combine it with the right hand side. Okay. So if you do that, the equation which we had, that is, you substitute this object on the left hand side, and then let us move the right hand side also to the left hand side, so that everything is on the left hand side and it is equal to 0. Then what you will get is this quantity GAL DUL by DS. Then you have a whole lot of terms, one term with a minus sign and two terms with the positive sign. So let me write it down explicitly for one. Minus dA of GLM plus DL of GAM plus DM of GAL. This whole thing multiplied by UL UM equals 0. Are you completely lost, or are you with me? Because I have just taken these terms, moved it to the left hand side. Everywhere there is a UL UM. I pulled that UL UM out, and inside there are three derivatives. Two derivatives come from these. They come with the same sign as this, and the one on the right hand side, when I move to the left hand side, it comes with a minus. Okay. So this entire quantity, just for convenience, we will denote by a simple gamma A LM. This is the notation. You put A, put a comma, and write LM. The A is a special index because the derivative with respect to A comes with a negative sign. Others are with positive sign. This object is clearly symmetric in L and M. This is symmetric in L and M. This is by construction symmetric in L and M. So the whole thing is symmetric in L and M. And of course, it is multiplied by something which is symmetric in L and M. So I got this. Now what I would like to have is an equation for just DUL by DS. That is easy because here they have a free index A hanging around. Suppose I multiply this by a term G, let us say AK. Actually, I am just taking the matrix inverse of this. So I am multiplying by G AK and I am summing over A. So because these are matrix indices, matrix inverses of each other, this is just Kronecker delta KL, it is diagonal unit matrix. So Kronecker delta KL, when it hits this L, it is only going to retain the term K there, everything else will go away. So I had to of course multiply this one also by the same term. So what I will get is that DUK by DS plus this quantity multiplied by GAK gamma A comma LM UL UM equals 0. This is just the same equation written like this. It is convenient to define another symbol for this. This is as though I am rising this index A, because every time I multiply by a k and then have a k there, this is like rising the symbol. So let us define another quantity. So this is the definition here. Gamma k Lm. This is defined to be GAK gamma A comma L. Once I have defined that, this equation can be rewritten as duk by ds plus gamma k Lm ul um equals 0. This is what we are after. Now that we have done a heavy bit of algebra, let us ask what this means. Given the metric in a given coordinate system, you can compute this quantity and feed it into Mathematica, it will compute it for you. So you can find all these objects. For every value of A, there are 10 Lm combinations because it is symmetric and each index can take 4. It is a 4 by 4 matrix which is symmetric, so it has 10 combinations. So there are 40 of them. So you can get all of them. Once you have all the 40 of them, you can solve this differential equation and that will give you a curve. And that curve will define for you what is the strike. As long as the derivatives of the matrix are non-zero, you will have gammas. These are called Christoffel symbols or connections, and these gammas will be non-zero. And these Christoffel symbols will be non-zero even in a sheet of paper if you use polar coordinates. So as a result of which you have to solve this equation if you want to find this equation to a straight line in polar coordinates in a plain sheet of paper. And as I explained yesterday, if you want to find a geodesic in the space-time geometry around a black hole, again you have to solve it. But conceptually it is no different from doing it on a sheet of paper in polar coordinates. So you have got a point. But our aim is to rewrite it in this form. That is also easy. What you do is you note that in this there is this first term duk by ds, which I can again write as let us say ul dl of uk. This is our old friend because dl ul, this dl is dxl by ds, dxl and dxl cancel, so it is d by ds. So this whole equation becomes, I am going to substitute this here. I have a ul dl of uk plus, I have pulled ul out, gamma k lm um equals 0. Now let us compare this equation with this equation. This was the wrong equation, and just for convenience I will write this as well. So if you compare these two, all that has happened is this dl gets replaced by this combination. And this combination we will call the covariant derivative of this object. I will denote it by the symbol nabla L UK. This nabla is not the gradient symbol in the normal vector analysis, so this is just one way of using. I could have used capital D. So I have a symbol which tells you how to compute the covariant derivative of a vector. You take the ordinary derivative and then you add a correction term involving gamma. If you are using Cartesian coordinates and if you are in flat space time, then you can have gamma 0, then this derivative goes back to this. Suppose you are in curved space time, so that you can't have a global Cartesian coordinate like on the surface of a sphere. But even then, in the curved space time, we know that there are freely falling frames where the gravitational effects go away. And we saw that the gravitational effects involve the first derivative of the potential came in the metric component as G00, so it is equivalent to first derivative of the metric. I will prove a result more rigorously if time permits, that you can always choose a coordinate system such that the first derivatives of the metric vanish. But I have already given you a physical argument in the previous day as to why it is reasonable. Therefore, if you go to the freely falling frame, the gammas will vanish, and in all freely falling frames, these quantities will be 0 and this will reduce to ordinary derivative. So, covariant derivative reduces to an ordinary derivative in the freely falling frame. This is extremely important. What it tells you is that, first of all, it is very important for calculation. If you have a tensorial expression, I can calculate it in any coordinate system I like. And if you calculate it in the freely falling frame, then you know that you don't have to worry about all the gammas. You don't have to even compute them. Their derivatives may not vanish, but they will vanish on their own. So, it simplifies calculation. Second, physically, it tells you how to define a Lorentz frame or a frame in which special relativity is valid. A locally inertial frame where the Lorentz transformation and all the things you learned in special relativity is valid. You just have to choose a coordinate system where the gammas vanish. So, we have done up to. But in the bargain, we have discovered a very important structure which mathematicians will introduce in a completely different way, namely the concept of a covariant derivative. So, let me write it down explicitly. A covariant derivative of a vector is the ordinary derivative of the vector plus a correction. So, you need to know how to correct, and let me give you the mnemonic for that. The way you correct it is that if it is an upper index, you put a gamma and you put a u. If it is an upper index, you put a plus. Whatever index you are correcting, you put it in gamma. Whatever index you are differentiating, you always put it on gamma. Then there is only one way the remaining index will go. So, this is what I told you. Tensor analysis is like cycling. If you don't think about it, it will work. Okay? So, you just put it in the remaining way which you can do. Now, at this stage, I cannot resist the temptation to just make a comment for those of you who will eventually go and learn things like gauge theory. This is a very general and very beautiful concept which we are introducing, but I don't have time to elaborate on that. But just to introduce that idea, look at this index L. This is differentiating with respect to the coordinate. So, let us assume I am in 4-dimensional space. Then L goes 0, 1, 2, 3. But let us look at this index K. Just for the moment, let me replace it by an index capital J. Capital J, capital J, and this is some capital M and capital M. This equation will remain valid even if I say that the capital indices go from 1 to 33. Nothing will go wrong. I think of them as some matrices. Each one labeled by L is a matrix, and it is a 33 by 33 matrix. And there is one matrix for L equals 0, one matrix for L equals 1, one matrix for L equals 2, and 3. This remains in space-time, but this has sort of flown off. It has taken wings and flown off. So, these are some kind of an internal indices at every point. And if you think of them as column vectors and think of these as matrices, I can just do it. This is a matrix equation where these are column vectors and these are matrices. These kinds of objects with one index and there is a possible matrix representation are called gauge fields. The simplest of them is electromagnetism, and non-abelian gauge fields are the ones where this is non-trivial. And these things are called connections in those systems. Now, the way mathematicians would like to do that is they will define a differential, they will define a manifold which has curves, which has tangent vectors, which has tangent spaces, and they can even have a dual to the tangent space if they want, but you have a tangent space. Then they will introduce connection as an extra structure. These are called affine manifolds. You don't need to have a metric in order to have a connection. You can define all these without the metric, where these are just given quantities. But it turns out that in physics, we do need the metric. For example, if you do gauge theories, you don't introduce a metric, at least not a metric in this sense. You have a connection, and then I'm going to describe something called curvature that will be there in gauge field as well, but not a metric. But in physics, when we are doing space-time, metric is a good place to start. So, I have motivated everything including this covariant derivative from a physical order. So, if you go and read mathematics literature, they will find that there is an affine geometry, and then you can have a metric and a Riemannian geometry, and you have to make metric and the affine compatible. I will explain it what that compatibility means in a minute. Fine. So this is an aside. Let us go back and introduce indices A, B, B. Okay, now we are back in space time. So you have this covariant derivative, and this is a definition. So we would like to have this definition for other objects as well. So to begin with, for a scalar, we will say that this derivative should be the same as this because there are no index to correct. Once you know how the scalar derivative works, and we will also assume product rule, then it is very easy to define how to define the covariant derivative of a vector with a lower index. What do? You take the one lower index object and one upper index object and multiply together, and its derivative should be ordinary derivative. We already know how to do the upper index, then you can figure out how to do the lower index. You will find that it is exactly the same as this except for a minus sign. So it is dl of VA, put a minus sign, take a gamma and take a V. Differentiating index always goes to L. Index we are going to correct is A, that also goes to this. There is only one way you can write the remaining index. Don't think. So you put it there and you have got it. Now what if I have an object with the two indices, say one up and one down? Then you will pick up another term with a plus sign when you are correcting for C. So again a gamma and a V. You are correcting for C, it goes here. Differentiating index is always here, and then you put a P and a P. Okay, of course I should have put C here and I should have put P. Okay. So this procedure works. I mean, as I was saying, most of tensor analysis is common sense and a very natural definitions which are being generalized. So you can do all this. But there is one interesting thing which comes out when you do this. Suppose you want to look at covariant derivative of a lower object, say VB. We know that this is covariant derivative of the lower one is obtained by saying GBC BC. Now this is going to be GBC dA of BC plus dA of GBC times VC. But wait a second, this is supposed to be a tensor. If it is a tensor, then if I start with this tensor which has one upper and one lower index, and I lower that index by multiplying by BZ, I will get that B here. This should be equal to this. So if this is equal to this has to be 0. So you get a nice result that the covariant derivative of the metric tensor should vanish. That is interesting. What does it mean? What it means is essentially, normally I would have said in flat space time, ordinary derivative of a metric tensor should vanish. But that is not a covariant statement. It changes when I go to polar coordinates. But if I generalize it to a really covariant statement and say covariant derivative of the metric tensor should vanish, it holds in all frames. But I have given you a definition as to how to compute the covariant derivative of a two index object. In fact, GAB is simple because both C and these are niche, so you will have 2 minus sign. So you can write it down explicitly, this object, and this is an exercise which I am giving to you. You work this out explicitly and you will get an equation with gammas and G's and all that. You should be able to show that that equation is consistent with this definition. That is, if gammas are like this, then this is identically correct. If it didn't, we would have run into trouble, but that is taken. Okay? Fine. Now having done all these, let us now go one step further and let us look at the question of defining the freely falling prime in an arbitrary coordinate. I gave you an intuitive argument and I said that, look, the metric was like a potential and the potential's gradient was like a force, and we could always go to an arbitrary coordinate system and make that force vanish. But in general, you have the entire metric GAB which is going to describe your gravitational field. How do I know that I can actually go to the frame in which the GAB is equal to eta AB and the first derivative is vanish? Okay. So think of this as a tensorial object. So think of this as some TAB. Then this object is TAC. So TAC GBC by definition is TJ. Therefore, these two should match. This is equal to this, so this should match. So I want to make this concept that there is a locally inertial frame or a freely falling frame at any point where the covariant derivatives of the, where the Christoffel symbols vanish, that is ordinary derivatives of metric tensor vanish, more precise. So let us do that. It is an interesting exercise, and we will do it just for pointing out something. We will do this in n dimension, okay, rather than in n is equal to 4. So what we are going to do is the following. Consider a coordinate transformation from xa to x bar a. Okay, this is some arbitrary function of xa. My aim is to choose this coordinate transformation such that at a given point, which I will take to be the origin in both, okay, let us just match the origin. So at the origin, I want my GAB in the new coordinate system, that is G bar AB, to be equal to eta AB. What is eta AB? Eta AB is -1, +1, +1, +1, which is the special relativistic metric. I also want the derivatives of the metric to vanish at the origin at that point. I would also like second derivatives to vanish. Okay. If this is possible, then I will get more greedy and I will say that I want third derivatives to vanish. If I can make all the derivatives vanish by a coordinate transformation, then I know that all curved spacetimes are flat. That would have been a beautiful result. But of course, it is absurd. So it shouldn't happen. Somewhere along the line, it should go wrong. What we will find is that it goes wrong here. But we have already seen it yesterday. So I'm just making formal a physical thing which I told you. If you think of potential as giving the metric, we knew that we could go up to the first derivatives of the metric, which is the gravitational force. We can make it 0 by going to an accelerated frame. That is what we are doing here. But the second derivatives of the metric, you cannot make it go. So how do you do that? There are several ways, and I will try to give you a physical argument again. So the physical argument is, think of a Taylor series expansion of this near the origin. So what we are going to do is call it Aij xj. This is the first term, linear term. Then I am going to have Bijl xj xl. Then I am going to have a cubic term, which is Ci Lmn xl xm xn. No, that is enough. I don't have to do any further. Here itself we will show that there is a contradiction. So this is just a function which is being Taylor expanded. What I am going to do is to choose A, B and C, all of them, in order to satisfy this condition, this condition, this condition. It is an elementary combinatorics. How many conditions are here? How many components I have in A? That takes care of it. How many conditions are here? How many components I have here? That takes care of it. How many conditions are here? How many components are here? That will take care of it. So let us try that out. So we will start with whether I can satisfy this by choosing A correctly. How many conditions are there? This is this quantity is symmetric, and we are in n dimension. So how many components does a symmetric matrix in n dimension have? That is half n into n plus 1. N square is the total. Take off the diagonal, then divide by 2 and add the diagonal. Okay, and you will get it. So this many components you have. How many parameters I have here? For every value of I and j can take n values. So there are n square of them. So this is the condition, and I have n square as okay. Let me do it the other way around. I have n square parameters, and I have to satisfy this many conditions. So if you subtract that, you get half of n into n minus 1. This is just NC2. So what does it mean? What it means is that if I use these parameters to set this condition, after setting this condition, I have NC2 free parameters left. Why is that so? That is actually intuitively quite clear. Suppose I have reduced the metric to this form. Even after that, think of this as normal metric with a normal all positive sign. So I have reduced it to 1, 1, 1. It is like dx square plus dy square plus dz square plus dw square, etc. in n dimension. After I reduce that, I can still rotate the coordinate system without changing it. How many ways I can rotate? Hopefully, you have not been completely brainwashed into thinking of rotations about an axis. You never rotate anything ever in your life about an axis. You always rotate in a plane. Okay, because the plane and the axis works in 3 dimensions. You just go beyond 3 dimension rotation in a plane, you can't correspond an axis to. So every plane defines a rotation, which means that there are NC2 planes. So in every plane you can rotate, and that is the free parameters you are left with. This is just the Lorentz transformation. There are 6 xy, yz, zx kind of rotation, and tx, ty, tz Lorentz group. So that is what is left. Fine. So that is okay. I can set this. This is all right. Now let us go to this. How many conditions are there? This is again, you have, that is also easy. The number of parameters, let us count first. Number of parameters for every value of I, there are n values of I. This is symmetric. So this is this into half of n into n plus 1. And how much is this? That is also the same, because for every value of A, this is n into n plus 1. So this is n into half of n into n plus 1. This is 0. So you have no freedom left, but you just about manage to choose this in such a way to make this. This is what we need. What it is telling you is that by choosing these coefficients, I can get the point, get the metric to have the standard form, and I can also make the first derivative 0. So not only that the metric has a particular value at a point, even in a small region around it, it maintains it. I can put a small dabba there. That is the freely falling box inside which you are performing the experiment. At a point, you can always reduce metric to a diagonal form. That is just matrix diagonalization. The non-trivial statement is that you can make the first derivatives of the metric go to 0 by choosing a particular coordinate. This is all we need, but just for fun, let us see what happens at the next level. That is a bit non-trivial. So you have to first count how many parameters are here. So of course, this n has, the I has n values, but you need to know how many parameters are here. So this is a 3-index object, but it is completely symmetric in all the 3 indices. So this is going to be an exercise. You should be able to show that that is n plus 2 C3. Actually fairly simple, but try it out. So if you have a 3-index object and the 3 indices are completely symmetric, how many independent components this can have? This goes for a ride. You only have to do this part, then you multiply by n. So what is this? This is going to be n into, this is 3 factorial is 6. Just make sure I don't goof in the algebra. N plus 2 into n plus 1 into n. This many parameters I have. How many conditions do I have? That is easy, because this is symmetric and this is symmetric. So the conditions which I have is minus 1/4 n square into n plus 1 the whole square. So we have to just compute this quantity. elementary algebra, you should get 12 n square into n square minus 1. Just do it, you will get this number. Oh, incidentally, it tells you if you take a perfect square and multiply by one number below that, it is divisible by 12. Okay? Except that that can be proved much more trivially in 20 seconds, so you don't have to do this. But this is the number you get, and if you are at n is equal to 4, this will give you 20. What does it mean? What it tells you is that now, okay, the sign is important. I think you will get minus. Because what you will find is that the number of coefficients which you have is less compared to the number of conditions. Okay? So I had always taken the number of freedom which I have in my hand minus the number of conditions, and you will find that the conditions which I have is larger and the answer is negative. So I cannot satisfy. So there are 20 independent components in this second derivative which you will not be able to set to 0. You can set a lot of them to 0, that is good, but you cannot set 20 of them to 0. This 20 is what tells you what a genuine gravitational field is. These involve the second derivatives of the matrix. Is that clear? Okay. Yeah. Yes, you can do it just in one dimension, but not in any other dimension, because in one dimension what happens is that your ds square is f of x dx square. So you define a new coordinate which is square root of f dx. This is capital Dx square. All one-dimensional spaces are flat. Okay, so it does not have an extra degree of freedom. So in fact, that is a good example. That tells you that in one dimension, all one-dimensional spaces are flat. And similarly, if you take two dimensions, it turns out that they are all flat multiplied by a function. There is only one degree of freedom in two dimensions. That also you can show here. So let us see, what do you get for 2? For 2, you get a 4 into 3, exactly. You have just 1 degree of freedom, which you cannot throw away. And that 1 degree of freedom is a multiplicative degree. By the time you go to n is equal to 4, it is 20 degrees. And that is what we have to deal with. Okay? Fine, it's good you pointed that out. And that is the reason. It is always flat. Okay. Now let us go back to the physics which comes from that. I have told you that the first derivatives in the metric can always be made to go to 0. But that tells you something very physical. Suppose you want to know how a particle is going to move in the gravitational field, because yesterday somebody asked me this after the talk, because I just said, orbits in black holes and all that, but that was a kind of a qualitative statement, but let us make it rigorous. I want to know how a particle is moving in a gravitational field. Can I do that? Actually, I can, because I already know that if I go to the freely falling frame, there is a particle which is moving, and I look at it in the freely falling frame around it, there the laws of special relativity is applicable because gravity has gone away. Therefore, in that particular region, this equation holds. This equation in general doesn't hold, but at that point in that freely falling frame, this exact equation, this gamma vanishes. As a result of it, this equation holds. So I know this equation holds. Okay, so I'm going to do this by a reverse engineering process. I have an inertial frame defined by the freely falling frame. In the freely falling frame, this equation holds. But suppose there is somebody else who is near me in the freely falling frame, and he is using an accelerated coordinate, which he can. And he wants to describe the same equation. He will describe it like this. He has just taken a coordinate system into a different nonlinear coordinate system, and he will have non-zero gamma, and he will describe it like this. But then this equation, that is UL dl of UK. So let me write it down once again. UL dl of UK equals 0 is completely covariant. This is valid in any coordinate system. Therefore, I don't need to talk about freely falling frames anymore. Therefore, a particle which obeys special theory of relativity in the freely falling frame will obey this in general. This comes from principle of equivalence. We first say that in principle of equivalence tells you that the particle is going to follow a freely falling trajectory. In the freely falling frame, it is going to follow the trajectory dictated by special relativity. Then if I change my coordinates to curvilinear coordinates, then I know that the same equation can be written like this. But what you do in curvilinear coordinates and what you do in curved spacetime has to be the same if locally the gravitational effects cannot be distinguished from anything. Therefore, this is the equation for a particle which is moving from point to point. As a bonus, we get something very beautiful. The motion of a particle in a gravitational field can be described nicely by a variational principle. The particle moves from point to point in such a way that it is an extremum of this quantity. Because it is the extremum of this quantity which we computed in order to get this equation. Remember, this is what we did to get this equation. We got that equation yesterday. So a particle in a given gravitational field described by the metric GAB moves in such a way that it extremizes this. So let us just check it out. Let us do it for a weak gravitational field. So in weak gravitational field, how does it look? So in the weak gravitational field, I have to do integral a square root of that GAB. Of course, it comes with a modulus, and I would like to make sure that when the particle is at rest, it is a positive quantity. So I will take it to be 1 plus 2 phi by c square dt square minus dx square. Remember, this was the expression for ds which we derived yesterday. So take the dt out, rather c dt out. So I have a c dt coming outside, and dx square by dt square is v square. So this is v square by c square is what we have. And remember, we are working on everything to the lowest order in 1 by c square. So this one is very large. This is small. The speed of the velocity with respect to speed of light is small. We are doing Newtonian subrelativistic dynamics. Therefore, the square root can be replaced by a half. So now, in order to clean it up a little bit, let us rewrite it. There is a 1 and a c dt integral. That I don't care. That is just c times the total time between t1 and t2. But look at the rest of it. The rest of it, if I pull out a minus sign, it is integral c here dt. There is an 1 by c square. Take that 1 by c square also out. This is 1 by c. The rest of it with a minus sign out is half v square. Because I have pulled a minus sign out, this becomes pi. So a particle in a gravitational field moves in such a way that this quantity is an extremum. This is, if I just multiply it by m and divide by m, where m is the mass of the particle, this is just kinetic energy minus potential energy. This quantity is called Lagrangian. When Lagrangian dynamics is taught, nobody ever asked, why is kinetic energy minus potential energy is the Lagrangian? Kinetic energy plus potential energy I can understand, that is the total energy. What the heck is kinetic energy minus potential energy? It is in fact nothing. There is no physical system known to humanity for which the Lagrangian is exactly kinetic theory minus potential energy. It works in 2 approximations and only in 2 approximations. One approximation is this: particle in a weak Newtonian gravitational field. Second approximation is a charged particle in an electrostatic field. You even put in a little bit of time dependence, and so that there is a magnetic field, it doesn't work. Lagrangians are not kinetic theory minus potential energy in general, so don't get that idea out of your head. Lagrangians are beautiful objects, but they are not kinetic energy minus potential energy in general. So this is one of the examples, and if I had just given it to you, it makes absolutely no sense. I told you yesterday, exact theories are much more sensible than approximate theories. This approximate theory doesn't make sense, but in the exact theory, it is just minimizing the length or the total time it takes to travel from place to place, the total clock time. That is what is being extremized. That is a very beautiful physical principle. And when you take the non-relativistic approximation, of course, you screw it up and you come up with Lagrangian minus potential, kinetic energy minus potential. So, of course, this tells you that the particle does follow this equation, because this is the equation you would have got if you had worked all of them out. It is a lot easier to just do it in this way. Okay, fine. Now let us do the last bit, which I wanted to sort of finish off with, which is the actual curvature. What we have said so far is that there is the metric, which can be reduced to the flat spacetime metric. There is the first derivatives, which are like gravitational force. You can also have that interpretation coming from this. d uk by ds is the acceleration of a particle coming from gravity. So, if I move it to the right hand side, this is like the force, gravitational force. Of course, there is a velocity dependent force, but that is what happens in general relativity. That is the force, and that force can be made to go away by going to a frame where this first derivatives vanish. But we studied in the Newtonian case that if you look at the deviations of the geodesics, that cannot be made to go away by taking any coordinate. So, the real nature of gravity is encoded in the deviation vector between two geodesics and its acceleration. So, I have to redo what I did in that lecture, where we finally found d square phi by dx alpha dx beta. Now, we should find a corresponding expression in general. That will lead you to the notion of curvature. So, let me try to do that. This is probably the heaviest, this is what is going to be the heaviest mathematics, but I am going to leave the last bit where you actually have to do a lot of index manipulation for you as an exercise, but that will be a good exercise for you to try out. Up to that point, I will work. So, what we are going to do is exactly what we did in the previous case. So, there are these trajectories. And the trajectories are at, okay, let me use two parameters. This is time, I will call it tau. Maybe I should still call it S, but okay, it is, let us say yes. So, this is S is equal to 13, S is equal to 14, this measures time, 13.1. So, as time goes on, the particles are moving, and the particles are on various trajectories, and the trajectories are again labeled by some n is equal to 12, n is equal to 13, etc. Okay. So, you have a Kriskov, and the position of a particle at any time is given by the four coordinates xi as a function of s and n. You have to tell me which curve I am, which particle I am talking about, and how far it has moved, what is the time you are denoting. This immediately gives you two vectors, just as in the previous case. That is why I did that case in great detail. dxi by ds, which is the velocity vector ui. It also gives you another vector, which is dxi by dn, which is some kind of a separation vector between the 2 points. So, this is n and this is u. Now, what did we do previously? We took the second time derivative of this. So, here of course, we have to generalize that notion. For that, we go back to this. We have a relation here, take away the uk. The time derivative d by ds is just dl dl in the non-covariant language, in the locally inertial sign. But if you want to generalize it, you have to take it to be ul nabla n. So, this is like a time derivative, but it is generalized. So, maybe I should denote it by capital D here. Okay. So, I want to take two time derivatives of that kind. So, what I want to do is to compute this quantity d square ni with respect to ds square. So, the capital D tells you that this is coming from that kind of an object. So, it is ul dl, another um dm. This is like two operations of d by ds, but these are not ordinary derivatives but covariant derivatives. That is what this indicates, acting on ni. Let us see what this is. In order to do that, I just need one identity, and that identity is the following. Let me write it down on top. dm of ni is equal to, here I can flip n and u, nm dm of u. How do I know that? You can do a brute force computation and prove it, but that is a clever way. This is a tensor equation. This is an example of what I have told you. This is a tensor equation. It is valid in all frames. Go to the local inertial frame. Their gammas vanish. Then this is just the ordinary derivative. So because it is an ordinary derivative, what I am doing here is d by ds of ni. I am saying that is equal to d by dn of ui. This is obvious because ui is dxi by ds. So this is going to be d square xi ds, and this will be d square xi ds dm. Because the partial derivatives commute, this is true. So this is just to illustrate how powerful that principle is. So this condition I will repeatedly use. So first I am going to use it here. So I will write this as ul dl, and inside this I will flip. So it is nm dm of ui. Now I am going to expand it out. What I will get is that I first get ul nm, take that out, dl dm of ui. So I have pulled n out and differentiated. Then I have to take the derivative of n. So that will be dm ui into ul dl nm. I again play the same trick. I interchange n and u. This is n and this is u. Okay. So I have got up to this. Now what I want to do is to write this slightly differently. I take this factor and put it on the right. It is nabla m of ui. And keep this bracket like this. What I am going to do is I look at this object and write it as dl of um dm ui minus um dl dm ui. That should be obvious because if I differentiate this, I am going to get dl um dm ui, which is what here it is, and then I will also get dl dm of ui, which I have subtracted out. Why do I do that? Because I know this is 0. Why is this 0? We have it here. U with the same index acting on something else is 0. Because these are moving along the geoda 6. Therefore, this term goes away and I have only this term left. And this term is going to be multiplied by NL here. So what I get is UL NM DL DM UI minus NL UM DL DM same DL DM UI. Now what I want to do is I have a UL, but there is an NL here. So I flip N and L in the L and M in the second term. So I'm going to make this M, this L. So I make this M and this L. Then I take out this NM and UL. So I have this. This can be written as UL NM, a commutator of DL commutator DM acting on UI. So let me keep this quantity on the left hand side again for you, d square Ni by ds square is this quantity. This is the result. Let us stare at this equation. The rest of it is just mathematics. You can reproduce it or read it up in a text. What it tells you is that I had this bunch of particles which I had thrown up in a gravitational field, follow a trajectory in the space-time, and between any two geodesics, I have a geodesic deviation vector Ni. This is true? Okay. Let us look at this. This is a tensor equation, so I can look at it in any frame. In particular, let us look at it in the freely falling frame. Then what it becomes is that it is dm of Ni equals nm dm of ui. This is the identity I need to verify. Now, dm is nothing but d by ds, and nm dm is nothing but d by dn. Ni, on the other hand, is dx by dn. So this is dxi by dn. Ui, on the other hand, is dxi by ds. Since ordinary partial derivatives commute, this is true. Therefore, the other equation. Of course, you can write that down completely in full glory, and you will find that it is true, but it is just a clever way to prove it. Okay, so we have thrown all these particles around, and they are moving along geodesics, and there is a geodesic. You have a question? Yeah. If you do it in 4-dimensional vectorial notation, it is trivial. Yeah, but I just thought I will go through the steps to prove that stuff. Yeah. So you take this deviation vector, and you are looking at the second derivative of that deviation vector. Now, you should go back to what we did long back. I mean, we did exactly the same calculation. Oh, okay. I confused the second hand with the other hand, and I panicked for a minute. Okay. So this is, yeah. So this is the second derivative of the deviation vector, which is like the geodesic acceleration, geodesic separation vectors acceleration, which is a true characteristic of the gravitational field. This is what we have seen. So we are trying to find out what is the true characteristics of gravitational field in the full Einstein state. So we have computed, and we have got this result. What it tells you is that you have to compute the commutator of the covariant derivatives acting on ui. If it has been ordinary derivatives, you would get 0, because ordinary derivatives commute. Do covariant derivatives commute? So this is a beautiful calculation to do. They do not commute, and it is something which will actually build your character. So you should go and do it. I am not going to do it for you. I will just tell you how to do it. So the result you will get, when I write down, you will know why it will build lot of character. Okay, let me first write down the result. So the result is that if you have I am going to come back to the physical meaning of left hand side in a minute. So let me finish this, and then I will get back to it. Why that n is important and what it measures. N is the geodesic separation vector. There is one geodesic here and another geodesic here, and you take both the geodesics at the same time. That defines a curve, and this is the tangent vector to that curve. So it tells you if I sit on one geodesic and I look at the other geodesic, with what acceleration it is approaching or receding. So if I work this out, if I compute this quantity dl commutator dm acting on a vector vi. We used which vector there? Ui. Okay. Acting on a vector ui. Yes. Was there a question? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Everything in physics is continuous. Okay. That is true. That is true. But we are assuming that functions are Cn where n is as you need, at least C2 or C3. Okay. To dl dm acting on ui, you can show is equal to a quantity with 4 indices. This is as bad as it gets, j and this uj, where this quantity Rij Lm has an expression which looks very complicated, but I will tell you a mnemonic to how to remember this. You write dl, the last two you catch on, of some gamma m plus you write a gamma L gamma m. I told you that it is best to think of these gammas as some kind of one index and rest matrices. Then you put this I and j here, and I want to put I and j here. You put I on this, j on this. So this is a matrix multiplication. You put a k here, and you put a k here. So this is one quantity. Subtract from it, because this is antisymmetric in L and M. Subtract from it the term which you obtained by interchanging L by M. Sorry? Oh yes, that is correct. That is correct. This is it. Yeah. Okay. So this is just a result. If you start asking what each of these terms mean, they don't have much meaning. So this is the definition for Rijklm, and there are several comments which I need to make. Firstly, the left hand side is completely tensorial. These are double covariant derivatives of an object, etc. Right hand side, this is a tensor, therefore this is a tensor. This is called the curvature tensor or Riemann-Christoffel tensor. This tensor is defined in terms of derivatives of the gammas and squares of the gammas. Now, if you try to calculate it in a local inertial frame, gammas will vanish, but their derivatives will not vanish. Now, the gammas involve first derivatives of the metric, therefore, this involves second derivatives of the metric. There is no way you can do a coordinate transformation and make this vanish, all the components vanish. That is what I proved. As an aside, you also know that this can have only 20 components, because we know that only 20 independent objects we couldn't set to 0 by making a coordinate transformation. So right now, each one of them can go 4. So 4 into 4 into 4 into 4 is what it looks like. But there is a lot of symmetry. There is an obvious anti-symmetry in L and M. There are various other symmetries, because of which it will get reduced to 20 components. In fact, it will get reduced to 1 by tall n square into n square minus 1 in n dimension. Now, how do you prove this? So I told you that it is going to build your character, but let me just indicate to you how to prove this, and then you work out the details. What you do is you have to compute this quantity. So you have to compute second derivative, the second covariant derivative. So you take the covariant derivative with respect to dl of dm of ui. Okay, this is what you need to compute. And once you have computed it, you interchange L and M, you will get the second quantity and you can subtract. So you only have to do this computation. What will this look like? Let us see how it will look like. So this is dl of some object. So that is going to be ordinary derivative of that object plus gamma times that object. So I am suppressing all the indices. This is a kind of a highly surrealistic expression for this object. Now you work this out. What will you get? This is dl of, even this is not needed. This quantity is going to be ordinary derivative of u plus gamma times u. And here you will have gamma, ordinary derivative of u plus gamma times u. So when you work them out, there is going to be second derivatives of u, it will look like, and then there is going to be derivatives coming from here. What will they be? There is a second derivative of u term, then you will have a u d gamma term, then you will have a gamma du term, this is also gamma du term, and then you will have gamma square u term. Okay. When you take the antisymmetric combination and subtract, you can obviously see that this will go away. Okay. It turns out that this will also go away. So you will find when you take the antisymmetric combination, these two will go away, and you will end up with u times d gamma plus gamma square. That d gamma plus gamma square is this, that u is here. So this you work out. It is a very good exercise in index manipulation. Don't look it up in a textbook. Actually calculate it and subtract this quantity, and you will find this is the result. So what does it mean for us? What it means for us is that if you do this kind of a thought experiment of throwing a lot of particles in some space time and letting them go through their geodesic, then the geodesic deviation vector has an acceleration which is given by ul, ui, let me put ul and ui, and then, okay, or let me write it in exactly the same way I wrote it there, nm. Then this quantity is R, Lm, J, I, U. Yeah, that is what I am going to do now. So now what is this left hand side? Okay, this is what he was also asking. So the physical way of thinking about it is the following. Remember that when we did the Newtonian gravitational field, I said that if I have an elevator and a flat earth, the particles are going to fall in a straight line, and the separation on top and the separation at the bottom are the same. Let me draw that picture once again for you. So the picture was, I have a rocket ship going up like this, and this is the earth, and we said that if it is flat earth, this is going to fall like this, and here also it is going to fall like this. Then I corrected it, and I said that, look, earth is not really flat, the gravitational field of the earth is not really uniform near the earth's surface. Because of the curvature, the correct picture is something like this. And here, of course, nothing changes. This is still in interstellar space. So here these two things are going to fall down like that. But in this case, what is going to happen is that these two particles, one is going to go towards the center of the earth like this, and the other is going to move like this. So this separation is going to come down. Right? You remember this picture. Now what am I computing here? This is a geodesic. Now if you go and do all the GR and you take the metric of the earth and you compute how this particle is going to go, this particle is going to follow a geodesic. This particle is going to follow a geodesic. So there is a geodesic deviation here, which is the vectorial separation between the two particles at a given time. So the precise definition of that is that you have thrown the particles around, and the particle's position at any given time is denoted by a function like this. You have to tell me which geodesic I am talking about and what is the proper time of the clock along that geodesic. Now I can draw in this lines of constant S. Then I can define two kinds of tangents. One kind of tangent is here and the other kind of tangent is here. Everybody seems to be comfortable with this tangent, which is the velocity vector. What does this tangent measure? It measures the separation between two nearby geodesics. That's it. So it is the separation between two infinitesimally separated geodesics at the same given time. So that the mathematical definition is just this. Given this function xi of s comma n, you compute this one. I didn't quite recognize who asked the question. Yeah, okay. So no, but then somebody else followed up, I thought. Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is the geodesic deviation. Okay. Now let us ask a few more questions. There is one slightly tricky point there. Why am I taking its acceleration? Well, let us look at geodesics on a sheet of paper. On the sheet of paper, this curvature r is 0. That means its acceleration should vanish. But how does the geodesic on a sheet of paper behave? You draw true straight lines. Take a separation between them. Take two ants which are crawling on the surface of a table, and at any given time you know the positions of the ants, right? And they are moving with uniform velocity. Now the geodesic deviation vector does change, but it changes linearly with time. So the linear change of geodesic deviation doesn't count. You want a nonlinear change, that is why you take the second. Another classic example is geodesics on the surface of a sphere. That is quite a nice example. Take two longitudes. So if I take two longitudes, at any given time, a geodesic deviation vector is a tangent vector to the latitude. So let me draw that for you. So you take sphere, there is a point, this is one geodesic, this is another geodesic, and things are moving along it with uniform speed, let us say. So I can draw latitudinal circles, and the tangent to the latitudinal circles is like the separation vector, and this is my velocity vector. How does this separation behave? First it increases. It keeps increasing until equator. Then it starts decreasing. So it is clearly has non-trivial acceleration. It is not going uniformly. But if you do exactly this on a sheet of paper, it will keep diverging. It is never going to converge back. So that is the difference between a curved geometry and a flat geometry. And that is where this curvature tensor is. So basically the geometry of the spacetime, which is what the title of this set of lectures is to be, sort of ends with this. You start with a metric, then from a physics approach, the metric defines for you something called the connection or the Christoffel symbols. These are first derivatives of the metric. Then the connections define for you through this kind of a relation curvature tensor, which defines the curvature of the space. They involve the second derivatives of the space. What we have seen in great detail is that at any given point, you can go to a coordinate system such that the first derivatives of the metric vanish. The moment first derivatives of the metric vanish, I have a frame in which the laws of special relativity hold. Because the gammas are 0, metric reduces to the special relativistic form. Then if I write it down in a covariant way, which is essentially ordinary derivative should be replaced by covariant derivative, and then you have the whole structure for you. Using principle of equivalence, I can generalize it to a curved geometry. So if I know special relativistic laws, because I didn't take things like electromagnetism, suppose I know how to write electromagnetic field equation in special relativity, and suppose I want to know how gravity affects the electromagnetic field equation, I can do that immediately. I write down the special relativistic laws of electrodynamics. Wherever I see ordinary derivative, I replace it by covariant derivative. And all the tensors I define in the natural curved geometry. But that is exactly what you would have done even if you want to do Maxwell's equation in a rotating frame of reference. It is not an inertial frame. So if you go from an inertial frame to a non-inertial frame, you have to introduce these covariant derivative objects. You would have written it down, and then you can carry this forward. So the principle of equivalence is an extremely powerful principle. It already determines for you how gravity couples to any system. You can get perverse and you can add by hand extra coupling. Like for example, from this curvature tensor, you can pick up terms and add to the coupling, and they will all vanish in flat space time. So I cannot figure it out. But what I am talking about is a minimal prescription which tells you how gravity affects rest of the matter. What we still need, which I won't do in this course, but I had to give you an orientation, is how does matter generate gravity. Now, in the case of Newtonian gravity, we again had this gravitational potential, and the gravitational potential satisfied an equation in Newton's theory, which is del square of phi. This del is ordinary vector calculus del, equals 4 pi g times the mass density of matter. Okay. This is just Poisson's equation, which you know in electrostatics generalized to gravity, both follows Coulomb's law, 1 by r square, etc. So this is what Newton told us, that if you give me a matter distribution, I know how to compute the gravitational field. This is of course not consistent with special relativity, because if matter distribution changes at some time t, the phi also changes at the same time t, because this is only del square in space. So it is an instantaneous propagation which violates special theory of relativity. So you need an equation which generalizes this. That equation should have on the left hand side something like the second derivative of the potential. So we expect it to contain something like the second derivative of the curvature tensor. It's second derivative of the metric, which is this curvature tensor. On the right hand side, you have an object which is the density of energy. It is density of matter, but because E is equal to mc square, it is the density of energy. So you need a definition for how to come up with a density of energy. You can do that. This involves something called energy momentum tensor in special and general relativity. And if you take that and you use the most natural object on the left hand side, you get an equation which essentially connects a particular variant of this curvature tensor to the distribution of matter. But that is really physics, that is not geometry of space-time which we are talking about. And that determines for you how the matter distribution generates the gravitation. And that would have sort of completed GR, but this is where we stop. And just to remind those who are mathematically inclined, since we introduced connection and curvature, I told you that the connection is a very general concept. And even when I wrote it down in a way where you can remember how it comes about. Let me do that once again here. I told you that the curvature, when I am writing, I did it by saying RLM, if you were alert when you saw me write, and then you have a dl of gamma m. I could have put a minus dm of gamma l, which I just wrote there saying that you do that part in the end. Then I can put a commutator of gamma l, gamma m. Here I am thinking of all these objects as matrices. So there are two more indices I can attach to that. So if these two indices are also space indices, space-time indices, A, B, A, B, and you put a AB, because this is a matrix multiplication followed by AB. If you do that, you end up getting exactly the definition I have given here. But as I said, this A and B you can replace by some capital A and capital B and say that they go 1 to 13, while these things remain in space-time. If you do that, you get what in non-abelian gauge theories they call the curvature. Sorry? Yeah, field strength or curvature. I mean, so if this term is not there, then this is something called an abelian gauge theory, but otherwise it's a non-abelian gauge. So the everything which I talked to you about, the manifold structure and all that, with some differences, even works in particle physics and in gauge theories and all that. So you should keep that overall picture in mind. I mean, it is not that you need to know all the mathematics there. The second point for mathematically oriented people is that physicists approach it by definition very physically. But the way you would have introduced structures in mathematics is to start with a space, then make it into a manifold, and then you introduce curves. Once you introduce curves, there are tangent vectors to the curves at any given point. They define for you a tangent space. This is all the most primitive structure which you have. And then if you want to compare the vectors in one tangent space here with tangent space here, there must be some way of moving a vector from one place to the other. This is called a transport, and one way of transporting it is called parallel transport, and that requires a connection. And the connections are just something which connect vectors from one point to another. You don't need a metric for that, and that makes it what is known as an affine manifold. And then you can independently introduce a metric, and that metric will make it a Riemannian manifold. And if you want to be perverse, you can add an affine connection and a metric which are not compatible with each other. But in this particular approach, I made them compatible because there are two ways of thinking about a straight line. That is also a good thing to tell you at this stage. Suppose I have 2 points and I have a curve. One way of defining straight line is that you take all the curves connecting these two and choose the curve which has the extremum length. But then I need to define the length, and definition of length requires a metric. So if you have a metric, I can define a geodesic like that. But there is another way of talking about a straight line. When you are walking straight, what are you going to do? You move your nose in the direction of the nose. So you have a tangent vector, and the straight line is the one in which the tangent vector moves parallel to itself. This is a completely local definition. You take a point, you know how to get the next point. For that, you need only this concept of parallel transport, which I didn't introduce, but that parallel transport is closely related to this covariant derivative. So this requires only the connection, and you can define straight lines with this connection. And if you have both metric and connection in a manifold, I can define straight lines based on the connection and straight lines based on the metric. Normally, we would like to have these two straight lines to be the same. This would require the metric to be compatible with the connection, and that is the condition I wrote down. This definition makes sure that these two straight lines are the same. One straight line definition is completely local, you point the nose and move along that direction. The other definition of straight line is slightly global, you take the length of the curve and you minimize the curve. And these two definitions coincide if the affine and the metric are compatible with each other. In both the cases, given the connection, you can compute a curvature, and as he was pointing out, it is called the field strength in gauge series or something equivalent to that. And then this is the primary object which describes the curvature of the space. And in 4-dimensional space-time, there are 20 components to it which you can never make 0. And these 20 components determine how the curvature determines various motions of particles, etc. Finally, in physics, we need to determine that. You determine that using an extension of this into Einstein's field equation, which, as I said, is not part of this. I'll stop with that. So we still have some time, 5 minutes. So if there are any questions, this is your last chance. Okay. So the word gauge comes historically because Hermann Weyl had the idea that the length of an object can change from point to point. So since the lengths are measured in gauges, gauge in the real Taylor's usage of gauge, and the theories which had that was called gauge, and that is why even in electromagnetism we call it gauge transformation. All this comes from Hermann Weyl's idea of electromagnetism being unified with gravity in a particular way. But let us not worry about the semantics. What the gauge theory essentially does is to introduce, I wrote down and then rubbed it off. Yeah, it is the physicist way of looking at it. I will just say that it is a set of matrices. If the space-time is 4-dimensional, there are 4 matrices, 4 n by n matrices will define for me a gauge field. Okay? And any extra structure which you put in is completely irrelevant. No, that is what I am trying to simplify that. So it is just AI or gamma. Look at this gammas. Gammas are gauge fields. Okay. So yeah, actually it is simpler than that. Okay, it is 4 matrices. 4 13 by 13 matrices if your internal group is 13 by 13. Okay, right. Yeah. It's lovely to see how mathematicians think. Yeah, right? Yeah, okay. Sorry? Yes, gamma L, gamma M. Right. As a gauge theory. So, huge number of people have tried it and graveyard is full of them. You cannot do that. Okay. So, it would be lovely, right? I mean, because I have told you all this. So, you just take a particular gauge group and then define the connections and all that sort of a thing, and then gravity should come up. There is huge amount of literature on it. There are people who believe it can be done. I don't believe it can be done. And nobody has really succeeded. I will tell you where they fail. They fail at two places. First, in gauge theory, you do not have a natural notion of a metric. There is a metric which comes from the group theory and all that, but this is not a metric which is compatible with the connection. There is no notion of this length, etc., in a gauge theory. While gravity has a metric. So, somewhere along the line, you have to put it in by hand. That is the first problem. Second problem, nobody could come up with a reasoning as to why I put that capital A and capital B, and I repeatedly said it can be 13 by 13, 33 by 33, whatever internal group. Gravity works only if those internal indices are identified with the space-time indices. It is never clear why that has to be done. The most famous paper on this is by a guy called Gutiyama, which is very old. And what he did essentially was, at some stage, he was at least honest and he wound up and said that I had to make this identification. And once you do that, you are essentially reproducing Einstein's theory. And if you have a known Einstein's theory, there is no way you would have got it. The third question is, what is the natural gauge group you should use? So, the natural gauge group which people have tried is to use Lorentz group and gauge it. So, you take a global Lorentz group and you look at a local version of it, and then you try to develop that. That is a little tricky because the actual group under which Einstein's theory is invariant is a much larger group. It is an infinite dimensional group, and it is not even strictly speaking a Lie group the way normally people would have defined Lie groups. I mean, Lie groups will have finite indices for structure constants, etc. So, this is actually the general coordinate transformation group is much bigger than the conventional Lie group. Okay, so, a lot of theorems which work for conventional Lie groups do not work for this infinite dimensional group. So, these are the problems. And physical reason is that I believe things like Yang-Mills field live in space-time, electromagnetism lives in space-time, while gravity describes the space-time. So, if you try to get it as a gauge theory, it would not work, but that is a point of view. Any other questions? Yeah. Right. Absolutely, they are identical. They are identical. Fields for physicists is mathematical functions of space and time. An electric field is a specified function of space and time which satisfies certain differential equations. Okay. So, here I might have even called this gamma L as a gauge field. Then I would have said that this is also a field. There is a bit of an imprecise way of talking about it. I should have said this is a gauge potential and this is a field. But people do not do that. They just call it a gauge field, whether they are referring to the curvature or the connection. But physically, it is just a function of space and time. Just like electric field is the primary example of a gauge field. It happens to work with a gauge group U1. So, it is an abelian group. So, it is an abelian gauge theory. Any other gauge theory you work with will have a non-trivial internal group. And in electromagnetic potential and field strength, people sometimes even call vector potential as a field. So, field in a generic sense is just a function of space and time. For example, people who do fluid mechanics will talk about a density field and velocity field of water. If water is flowing, it has a density field which is the density as a function of space and time, and velocity field as a function. Exactly. I mean, Faraday, and originally with this thing, and even Maxwell, because the ether was supposed to be for them a fluid, and then various things, I mean fluid or a substratum of fluid, and things were going up and down in that. Because they had a very difficult time imagining that in the vacuum something can fluctuate. So they did not know what these electric and magnetic fields are. So they are familiar with things like water waves. So they introduced the concept of ether, and the fluctuations in the ether and vibrations of the ether, etc., were associated with it. So we have come a long way from that, and so the more precise way of, or at least a better way of thinking about it is just as abstract functions of space and time, which satisfy certain equations and which have some physical effect. Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you properly. Yeah. Correct. Right. You have a Lagrangian, but that is not kinetic energy minus potential energy. I didn't say Lagrangian exists for every known physical system. We don't know any law of physics which cannot be expressed from an action principle with a Lagrangian. What I said was a Lagrangian being kinetic energy minus potential energy, which is what all your classical mechanics 101 is about, is applicable only for two systems known to us. One is a particle in a weak gravitational field, the other is a charged particle in an electrostatic. For nothing else, the Lagrangian is kinetic energy minus potential. Lagrangian, of course, exists for everything. In fact, it's the other way around. We don't know any system which cannot be described without an action principle. Yes. Yeah, everybody writes it as T minus V. Lagrange himself wrote it as T minus V. But the thing is, we now know much better. First of all, when you write as T minus V, they knew Newton's laws of motion, and they wanted to write it in such a way that it gives you Newton's laws of motion, and then you can use generalized coordinates. There is great advantages in using the Lagrangian formulation of Newton's laws of motion. But what we are asking is that if you go to the fundamental level and you ask under what force fields the Lagrangian can be written as kinetic energy minus potential energy, is extremely limited. If you want exact, no force field known to us satisfies kinetic energy minus potential. If you are willing to be a little bit approximate, then particle in a weak gravitational field has kinetic energy minus potential energy. That is because behind the blackboard there is a much better thing, that it is a actual path length of the particle in the four-dimensional space-time. In the non-relativistic limit, it becomes kinetic energy minus potential. The reason electrostatic case it works is much more complicated. It has to do with gauge invariance. But even then, for a generic electromagnetic field, it will not work. So this is because every once in a while you will find in the literature, especially in American Journal of Physics and journals like this, somebody giving you an explanation why Lagrangian is kinetic energy minus potential energy. It's clearly fraudulent because Lagrangian is not kinetic energy minus potential energy. It's an approximate expression. So I just thought I will caution you not to take it very seriously. Any other?